This podcast contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing content related to real-life events, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
All right, so are you ready to dive into like a real head scratcher?
Oh, I'm always up for a good mystery.
Okay, perfect. So you know Paula Abdul, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Pop icon, amazing choreographer, kind of ruled the late 80s and early 90s.
Exactly, but there's this whole thing, this mystery that's been following her around, and honestly, it's been bugging fans forever.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
A plane crash. A plane crash, she says she survived, but here's the catch. It's nowhere, like literally nowhere to be found in official records.
Whoa, hold on. So we're talking about a full-on plane crash, and there's no trace of it.
That's what we're going to try and figure out. And the crazy part is, we've got all these sources, Paula's own interviews, articles where people have tried to investigate it, even some, like, serious deep dives on fan websites.
Wow, okay, so a real mixed bag of info.
Exactly. Should be an interesting ride, to say the least.
So what makes this even more interesting is that, timing-wise, this supposed crash happened when she was, like, at the peak of her career.
Right, exactly.
I mean, think about it, straight up. Forever Your Girl. Selling millions of albums, even choreographing for Janet Jackson. Huge.
Huge. Yeah. And then, kind of suddenly, things just slow down in the mid-90s.
Yeah, it's almost like she disappeared for a bit there.
Makes you wonder if there's a connection. Right?
Oh, for sure. You can't help but connect the dots.
Okay, so before we get into the whole crash mystery, maybe let's set the stage a bit. Paint a picture of where Paula was at in her career when all this supposedly went down.
Good idea. Context is everything.
We're talking 1991, 1992. Her Under My Spell tour is in full swing. She's performing night after night. Tons of pressure. You know.
Oh, yeah, totally. Constant travel, the physical demands of those performances, gotta be intense.
And then you throw in the whole, like, media spotlight on her in every move. I can't even imagine.
No kidding. It's like the perfect recipe for a story that's both, like, super captivating, but also totally confusing.
Right. Okay, so now let's get into the crash itself, the heart of the whole mystery.
All right, hit me with it.
So Paula's mentioned this crash a handful of times over the years, but the most detailed account comes from a pretty recent interview she did.
Oh, yeah. Which one was that?
It was on a podcast called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum.
Okay, I've heard of that one.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because she describes this scene like straight out of a movie.
Okay, now I really want to know what she said.
So picture this. She's on this private jet, everything's seemingly fine, and then bam, an engine explodes, the wing catches fire, and the whole plane just starts plummeting.
Oh my gosh, that's terrifying.
I know, right? And she doesn't hold back on the details.
Oh, I bet.
She talks about hitting her head on the ceiling of the plane, getting knocked unconscious, and then waking up in a cornfield with the plane, like, fully engulfed in flames around her.
That's insane. Just hearing you describe it is intense.
Right. And the crazy part is, she claims she wasn't alone.
There were other people on the plane with her.
Yes, 6 other passengers, according to her. And get this, they all supposedly survived.
Oh, wow. But I'm guessing it wasn't without, like, any injuries.
Exactly. She talks about a pretty serious spinal cord injury, multiple surgeries, years of recovery, the whole works.
It just sounds so wild. How could something that dramatic just vanish? Like, not even a trace.
That's what I keep coming back to. Especially with someone as famous as Paula Abdul, you'd think there would be some record of it somewhere.
You would think, right? Like, there'd be news articles, maybe eyewitnesses, something.
Nothing. Literally nothing. And that's what makes this whole thing so baffling, you know?
Yeah, especially when you think about how meticulous the NTSB is. Like, those are the folks, the National Transportation Safety Board, they keep records of every aviation accident in the U.S.
Right, and they have nothing, absolutely nothing, that even remotely matches Paula's story.
It's like this plane crash just never happened.
Exactly, and that's kind of the core of this whole deep dive we're doing.
Makes sense.
Like, how do we even begin to make sense of Paula's very vivid story when there's zero external evidence to back it up? It's like a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Well, I'm definitely hooked. What's next?
All right, so as we dig deeper into this, there's like this elephant in the room we have to talk about, and that's the inconsistencies in Paula's own story.
Oh, like what?
Little things here and there that don't quite add up.
Okay, give me an example.
Sometimes she says the crash happened in 1992. Other times she says 1993.
Okay, so the timeline's a little fuzzy.
Yeah. And sometimes she says she was wearing her seatbelt. Other times she says she wasn't.
Ah, I see. So it's like details changing over time.
Exactly. So the question is, what do we make of these inconsistencies?
Well, I'm ready to hear your take on it.
All right, let's dive in.
So those inconsistencies, I mean, it's tempting to kind of just dismiss her whole story, you know?
Oh, for sure, especially when the details keep shifting.
But what if we're looking at it the wrong way? What if these inconsistencies, instead of discrediting her, actually tell us something about how memory works?
Hmm. That's an interesting thought. You're saying we should be focusing on the psychology of memory, especially after a trauma like that.
Exactly. Think about it. Memory, it's not like a video recording. It's not perfect.
Right, it changes over time, gets influenced by our emotions, all sorts of things.
And especially with something as traumatic as a plane crash, your brain might try to protect you by, like, blocking out certain parts or even changing details.
Oh, so you're saying some of those inconsistencies could be her mind's way of coping with the trauma.
Possibly, yeah. It's like, imagine the pressure she was under back then. I mean, peak of her career, constantly in the public eye.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. The tabloids, the paparazzi, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. So maybe her memory of the crash got kind of intertwined with all that external pressure, you know?
Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's like her brain might have filled in the gaps with details that fit the narrative,
Yeah.
even if they weren't exactly accurate.
Right. It's not about intentionally lying. It's more about how our brains process and store traumatic memories.
So that might explain some of those inconsistencies, but it still doesn't address the elephant in the room, the complete lack of any external evidence.
True, true. It's like you'd think with 7 people on that plane, someone, somewhere would have mentioned something, right?
Right, and that's where things get even more like conspiracy theory-ish.
Oh, I love a good conspiracy.
Okay, well, get this. Paula has hinted at the possibility of NDAs being involved.
NDAs, like
Yeah.
non-disclosure agreements.
Exactly.
Whoa, hold on. Are we talking like a cover-up?
It wouldn't be the first time in Hollywood. Right. Think about it. A private jet, a celebrity passenger, maybe a not-so-flattering incident.
Yeah, I could see someone wanting to keep that whole thing hushed up.
Exactly. So maybe everyone on that plane was legally bound to stay silent.
That would explain the lack of witnesses coming forward for sure.
It would also explain why there are no news reports, no leaked documents, nothing.
Wow, okay, so we're talking like a full-on Hollywood conspiracy to protect Paula's image.
It's definitely a possibility.
Yeah.
But then, if that's true, who orchestrated it? And why go through all that trouble just to bury a story about a plane crash?
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they?
They really are. But even with the NDA theory, there's still something that doesn't quite sit right with me.
What's that?
Even if everyone involved was legally obligated to stay silent, you'd think there would be at least a whisper or rumor or something in all these years.
Right, especially in Hollywood, secrets don't stay buried forever.
Exactly. So it's like, even with the possibility of NDAs, the silence surrounding this whole incident is just deafening.
It is kind of eerie when you think about it like that.
Okay, so we've explored the idea of memory being unreliable. We've entertained the possibility of NDAs and a cover-up, but we're still left with this giant question mark hanging over the whole thing.
True, and it's like, where do we go from here? How do we reconcile Paula's story with the lack of any real evidence?
Well, maybe we need to shift our focus a bit. Instead of trying to prove or disprove the crash itself, maybe we should be looking at the bigger picture, the context of Paula's life at the time.
Okay, I like where you're going with this.
Because the mid-90s weren't exactly a walk in the park for her, both professionally and personally.
Oh yeah, things definitely took a bit of a downturn after that initial burst of success.
Right. Her 1995 album, Head Over Heels, it didn't do nearly as well as her previous hits, and then there were the 2 divorces, first from Emilio Estevez in 94, and then Brad Beckerman in 98.
Right, and there were those rumors about like eating disorders and maybe even substance abuse. Tough stuff.
Yeah, and we're not trying to like diagnose anything or draw any direct connections between these personal struggles and the plane crash narrative.
Of course.
But it's important to acknowledge that this was a really tumultuous period in her life.
Absolutely. It would be naive to think that those personal challenges didn't have some kind of impact on her, you know?
Right, and it's natural to wonder if those experiences might have played a role in how she processed and recounted the events of the alleged plane crash.
It's like when you're going through a lot, your perception of things can get a bit distorted, you know?
Yeah, for sure. So how do we navigate this sensitive territory? How do we balance respect for Paula's privacy with our desire to understand this whole mystery?
Good question. Maybe the key is to approach it with a bit more empathy, you know?
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Instead of getting caught up in the details of the crash itself, maybe we should be asking a different question. What does this plane crash narrative, whether it's factually accurate or not, what does it tell us about Paula Abdul?
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's not about proving or disproving the crash. It's about understanding the role it plays in her story, in her life.
Exactly. It's about looking at the narrative itself, how it's evolved over time, and what it might reveal about her state of mind, her struggles, her resilience.
Wow, okay, I'm even more intrigued now. Let's dive into that.
All right, so we've gone through a lot with this Paula Abdul plane crash, haven't we?
We really have. We've heard her vivid description, we've seen the lack of evidence, and we even talk about how memory can be, well, kind of tricky, especially after trauma.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but the big question still remains, doesn't it?
It does, it totally does.
Yeah.
What can we actually conclude from all this? Where do we land?
And that, my friend, is the million-dollar question.
It really is.
And honestly, there might not be a neat and tidy answer, a perfect conclusion.
Yeah, I'm starting to see that.
But you know what? Sometimes just exploring those gray areas, those unanswered questions, that can be way more insightful than finding a simple yes or no.
Okay, I like that perspective.
So, for argument's sake, let's play devil's advocate for a minute.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's say the crash, as Paula described it, didn't actually happen.
All right, I'm following.
What could explain her sticking to the story so strongly, even with zero proof?
That's the real puzzle, isn't it?
It is. It is. And we've touched on memory being unreliable, right?
Right, how it can change, be influenced by our emotions, that whole thing.
But there's another layer here, another thing to think about, the psychological impact of fame, the constant pressure to maintain a certain image, you know?
Oh, yeah. Especially back then, the early 90s, pre-social media, but still very much in the public eye.
Exactly. Imagine being Paula Abdul then, at the very top of her game, but also under this microscope, constantly scrutinized by the media, living up to the expectations of millions of fans.
Not going to be a lot to handle.
It is. So maybe, just maybe, this story, this narrative of surviving a horrific plane crash, it served a purpose, even if it wasn't entirely true.
You're saying it was like a way to cope, to explain things, maybe even protect her image?
It's a possibility, right? Think about it. A story like that instantly makes people feel sympathy. It can explain any career changes, any setbacks, even add a bit of mystique to her persona.
I never thought of it that way.
And it's not about consciously deceiving anyone. It's more about how our minds work, how we sometimes create narratives to help us deal with tough situations, protect ourselves from the harshness of reality.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It makes you wonder how much of what we believe to be true is actually shaped by the stories we tell ourselves.
Exactly. And especially in Hollywood, that line between reality and a carefully crafted story, it can get so blurred.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. Image is everything in that world.
It is. And sometimes the stories we choose to believe are the ones that best fit the image we're trying to project, the image we want others to see.
So are we saying that Paula Abdul just made this whole plane crash story up?
Whoa, hold on. Not necessarily. It's way more nuanced than that.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's about recognizing that we as humans have this tendency to shape our own narrative, especially when we're dealing with tough stuff, challenges in our lives.
And we can't forget the role of the media in all of this.
Absolutely. Back then, there wasn't the same level of fact-checking we have now. No social media to instantly call out inconsistencies.
Right, so if a story was good enough, if it fit the narrative, it could easily become truth in the public's eyes.
And even if Paula truly believed her account, it doesn't mean that outside forces, the media maybe, didn't play a role in shaping or even exaggerating the story over time.
It's like a game of telephone almost.
It really is. It just highlights how difficult it can be to separate fact from fiction, especially when you're dealing with events from the past with limited information, and then you throw in the whole world of celebrity and media hype.
It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
It really is. So, have we cracked the case? Solved the mystery of Paula Abdul's plane crash? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
But we explored some interesting possibilities, we questioned some assumptions, and maybe we even gained a deeper understanding of how memory, trauma, and storytelling all weave together to create these narratives that are both captivating and really hard to pin down.
That's a great way to put it. So maybe the real value of this whole deep dive wasn't about finding a definitive answer, but about embracing the complexity, the ambiguity of certain stories.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that sometimes the journey itself, the process of questioning, exploring different perspectives, that can be just as rewarding as finding a clear-cut solution.
I like that. I like that a lot. So as we wrap up, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I'd say it's a reminder to be critical, to really think about the information we consume, especially in a world where narratives are constantly being shaped and reshaped. Question what you hear, think about who's telling the story, and be open to the idea that there's always more to the story than what's on the surface.
Great advice. And on that note, I'll leave our listeners with one final thought to chew on. Does it really matter if Paula Abdul's plane crash happened exactly as she described it? Or is the real significance of this story about something bigger, about the power of narratives, the strength of the human spirit, and our fascination with mysteries that may never be fully solved?
I think that's a question for each of us to ponder on our own.
It is. It really is. Thanks for joining us on this wild ride.
It was my pleasure. Keep those minds open, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.